Hi. First, let's start with the introductions of the panelists. I'd like to introduce Iftikhar Waheed, Product Management Director at ENEA.
Hello.
Hi, Iftikhar. Then I would like to introduce Stephanie Lashley, VP Messaging Strategic Alliances and Infrastructure, Bandwidth.
Hello.
Hi, Stephanie. And finally, Paul Moores, Head of Fraud and Regulatory Product at Vonage.
Hey there, Nick.
Hey, Paul. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I'll jump straight into it. Isabel gave a great introduction. So let me just set the scene a little further. As the panelists know, and as I'm sure most of you watching this panel are aware, trust in messaging, like in the messaging channel, is eroding due to increasing fraud. We're seeing AIT, smishing, scams, and other types of fraud. And this is leading to brands to choose alternative channels and services such as passkeys. And it's also leading to increased regulatory intervention. This, in turn, is leading to a decreased revenue for all involved in the SMS messaging ecosystem. It's also leading to new regulatory requirements per market. That is, each country has its own set of rules and regulations. And for global brands, this is increasing the complexity for brands, aggregators, operators who must manage all these different rules in different markets. So the question we want to address today in the panel is, what can the industry do to combat fraud, return trust in messaging, and what kind of solutions are out there? Iftikhar, I thought I would start with you with the first question. Maybe you can talk to us a bit about the role of firewalls in combating fraud. I hear from MEF members kind of maybe not contradictory feedback. Some are very keen on firewalls and always wonder why more companies don't use firewalls. And others understand the use of firewalls, but feel that it's not the foolproof solution that addresses every type of fraud. So maybe you can expand a bit on these two concerns.
Sure. Thank you, Nick. So, a pleasure to be here. So to get started with, messaging firewall, as a messaging firewall vendor, we are usually at the front lines, missing of the fraud scenarios, explosion, and basically the shifts in this entire on this landscape. Now, one thing you pointed out fairly is that SMS is declining as the preferred messaging channel, and but at the same time, what is interesting is we see that it is also being subjected to a higher amount of fraud as time goes by. And this is odd because you see a declining channel and then it's still being subjected to more fraud. And what we see is that in the classical fraud use cases, such as SMS, spoofing, smishing, SIM boxes, they're still there. They're still there. What has effectively changed is the technique and the tactics that fraudsters generally use. And those have basically stepped up their game, gone to a whole new level. So traditionally, firewalls have always done rule-based lexical analysis, regex mapping, and I can get into more of those when we go further down. But the shift now is that you have fraudsters who have adopted newer techniques which are more making use of generative AI, and this allows them to both scale and also add a level of sophistication to the kind. So when you go back and try to implement the existing classical mechanisms to detect spam, they no longer are as effective as before, because when you use AI and things like that, that spam is now being more and more similar to what human. So they need to simply discriminate on that's, and we need to be more how to actually look at subtle patterns in where the traffic is routed, and that's where most of the focus is. I think this is also tied to your observation as to the effectiveness and how the firewalls are deemed their job in the industry and whether they are effective or not. Because
Hey, Iftikhar, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Your connection seems to be a bit spotty and you're freezing up on us. Maybe I'll go to one of the other panelists and you can see if you are able to either reconnect or fix it. Because right now oops, he's dropped. Well, that answers that. Yeah. Paul, from what we could hear from Iftikhar, he was bringing up a couple of things around AI. But let's take a step back. And I know for our members, there's a lot of concern around artificially inflated traffic or what we call AIT.
Mm.
Maybe you can expand a bit on the Vonage experience around combating AIT, why it's so pervasive, why is the industry struggling to resolve this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nick. So thanks. So AIT is a huge issue for enterprises, for brands, ultimately for Vonage customers, and for the ecosystem as a whole. It's one of these things that is slowly but certainly eroding trust in the messaging ecosystem. We've heard about phishing and spam and all of those sort of things. But AIT has been growing, and I think one of the reasons it's been growing is we've touched upon is things like AI and chat groups. It's the barriers of entry for somebody now to engage in artificially inflated traffic have no doubt reduced. At Barcelona this year, we published a white paper sort of talking about demystifying AIT and the effects on the market. And
sorry to interrupt. It occurs to me, maybe we're taking for granted that everybody knows exactly what AIT is. Is it worth quickly? Yeah.
Perfect segue. I was about to then go into let's talk about AIT, artificially inflated traffic. Because when I say that, we throw different definitions around the industry. So Nick, you're straight on it. So I'll have one definition, you may have a different one. I think there are some papers that say there are 7 different types of AIT. I like to categorize it as 2 different streams of AIT. And when we look into the types we see, I categorize them as supply chain attacks. And this occurs when we have perhaps a bad actor who's injected themselves within the supply chain, or somebody's collaborating with a dodgy supply chain partner. And that attack then is launched within the supply chain against the victim, who in this case would be a brand or an enterprise who's having traffic generated on their website artificially, usually one-time passwords that are then delivered through the entire supply chain until it gets back to the bad actor. They keep their interconnect revenue and they terminate the traffic. And the really, really clever ones even convert that back into a one-time password on the victim's website, so it looks like a natural login to them. That's really difficult to catch. But that's one example of supply chain. So supply chain is where you've got something in the ecosystem. The other flavor of AIT we see tends to be revenue share based attacks. And this can happen wherever there's an edge for a revenue share, basically. So you can purchase legitimate revenue share numbers from online websites. We also see it occasionally in certain markets where there are deals where carriers have perhaps themselves leased global titles. They've resold numbers. There's a revenue share arrangement. There are micro MVNE deals, MVNOs where you can sign up yourself, on a really small basis. Wherever there's a revenue share edge, that can happen. So that's kind of the what of AIT and the landscape around it. But I just touch briefly on then some of the root causes really, and kind of what we as an industry need to step up and take responsibility of. So if we get into the root causes, so let's talk about the supply chain aspect. So one of the reasons why it's so difficult is we have a very complex and at times obtuse supply chain model. There's multiple actors within a supply chain, certain business models as well that we see, if we look at the wider environment, are where carriers are sometimes going into direct agreements, they're going into exclusive agreements that are perhaps artificially inflating the price of SMS terminating into a country. Sometimes those exclusive agreements almost incentivize AIT within the supply chain, because to obtain that exclusivity, you may have had to commit to an extremely high volume. So what happens then? This is price volume economics. You win the deal. The price of termination in that country goes up. As the price goes up, the volume drops, and the brands move elsewhere. The actor stuck in the middle of that supply chain is left underwater. What do? There's an incentive there to go and commit or collaborate to commit AIT. So we, in our paper, we talk about responsibility there on, carriers as well, to think about, are they themselves creating this environment by, is exclusivity the right approach here? Because what they're ultimately doing is they've destroyed their SMS market. It's simple price. It's a simple price volume game. By pumping the price, the traffic has moved elsewhere. It's replaced with fake traffic, which goes away. Nobody wins. So I think in terms of, so on the supply chain side, what we talk about there is, looking for, trusted supply chains. So it's sort of carriers making open processes, having a trusted, transparent supply chain. And in the future, things like RCS improve this a little bit. I think it's going to be much harder to hide in an RCS supply chain, because of things like the MAP platform. So there's going to be better traceability, but there will always be the incentive to cheat where these agreements promote it. So that's on the supply chain side, which I think is particularly relevant for us in the industry. On the revenue share edge, again, what we say there is whether you're a carrier, whether you're a service provider, whoever you are in the industry, if you're providing or reselling access to services where there's a revenue share, you've got to have really good KYC. You need to have really good practices to ensure that the people you're dealing with are genuine people, and if they're not genuine people, that they're able to be prosecuted for it. That's ultimately the only way to do this, is to take people off the board. So that's perhaps an interesting can of worms to discuss, but that's our kind of worldview on like AIT generally. So as I said, the reason the industry has found it so hard to date is because of this obtuse supply chain. There's a lack of transparency, and it's quite difficult. There are different ways of committing AIT. There are some environments which so carriers don't even realize that they have created this. So
interestingly, I was just speaking to a member earlier today who were looking at unassigned number ranges and that sort of area where we could possibly do more. We should probably size the problem. I don't have the statistics to hand, but I know depending on the market, anywhere up to 40% of traffic in some markets is claimed to be artificially inflated traffic. So it is a pretty important problem.
Yeah, I think 40%, perhaps a bit. If you're looking selectively in certain markets, because the other side of it, what can you do about it? So we have gone one step further, and we've now started to move into the fraud protection space here as well. So we've got some customer product around us. And in those spaces, yes, you as a kind of actor within the supply chain wanted to fight AIT. Yes, you should be looking at your supply chain. You should also be looking at things like intelligence-based fraud services. What can you find that there are companies out there who have intelligence data? You also have a vast amount of data yourselves. You look at your traffic patterns, look at your organic traffic patterns, and if you put that together, there's a lot you can do yourselves to start to identify this. But it isn't simple because, like I said at the start, a sophisticated actor can replay genuine traffic and make it look exactly the same as a genuine transaction.
And it feels like there's a role for all the stakeholders in the supply chain. So it's not just the MNOs, the operators, I should say. It's also the CPaaS providers or aggregators. And even to some degree, brands might, at least should be more educated on this problem. And there could be ways for them to look at billing reconciliation with whoever's providing them their service.
And I think as well with brands taking ownership, I think this is a big part of what we do as well, which is customer education. When you go back to a customer who's been attacked with this, why have you been attacked? Because you've got a free text box on your, and sometimes these are not small institutions. They've got a free text box. You can choose which country would I like to send SMS to. Come download my app.
Yeah.
It's really no capture, no nothing, no basic security practice.
Low-hanging fruits for the fraudsters. Iftikhar, I'll come back to you in a second. Welcome back. Maybe Stephanie, I'll go to you. You can either expand on how Bandwidth is dealing with AIT, or maybe just talk more generally around what kinds of fraud you're seeing out there and what Bandwidth is doing to tackle it. Oh no, we've lost Iftikhar again.
Thanks, Nick. So I'll tackle the first part of your question first. So Bandwidth actually takes a three-pronged approach. So we are proactive, reactive, and we do this real-time monitoring. So Paul hit on, know your customer, know your customer's customer. So we are spending a lot of time validating our customers and their customers' use case on the front end. If there are issues that get through, we're taking action to make sure that we are monitoring for campaign drift. We are taking action on any blatant bad acting, and we're also taking very involved steps within the ecosystem to modify the 10DLC handbook to make sure that the messaging best practices are first and foremost with our customers. And then we're also doing this real-time monitoring to ensure that the customer behavior is relative to the use case registered. So we've seen some success doing this. And like I said, it's this three-pronged approach. As you know, Bandwidth is a global messaging provider. So while we have cut our teeth on the domestic side, we're really applying our learnings to the global market. So I would say fraudsters are getting much more savvy, and we all have to stay ahead of the curve and ahead of what they're doing. But I think it's really interesting because there's an opportunity here, and I know we're talking about artificially inflated traffic, but I do think there's an opportunity for AI here, and doing some machine learning and putting some of our data. Paul made a great point. We all have data, making that data work for us, and putting in checks and balances to catch the fraud using our own data. Those are just some things that Bandwidth's doing.
Cool, thanks, Stephanie. I think I'd like to come back on using our data and AI for sure. Because there's, I'll come back to it. But Iftikhar, I want to give you a chance because we couldn't really hear you well at the start. So let's talk again. If you could talk again a bit about ENEA and what you're doing around firewalls,
yes.
It'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think in a good context from Paul and Stephanie regarding the general what is AIT. So that eases my explanation. Traditionally, firewalls have always been looking for they've been pattern matching mechanism. So they've gone for regexes, more of a lexical analysis and things like that. And in that context, they've been able to isolate fraud and detect it, and that also. But at that point, they didn't. They were rather easy to how should I say use or to prevent any kind of excessive traffic in the network. Now, the problem with AIT that happens is that the means the fraudsters are generally using to pump traffic, they have changed. They generally tend to use, SIM-bank is one option, but ideally they've moved on to more elaborate techniques such as using generative AI. So, for example, there are two bots out there commonly known. I believe one is called a fraud GPT, and I forget the name of the other. But these actually allow someone to enable a fraudster to custom build a campaign, and not only custom build the campaign, but to adapt it as quickly as possible. So there is constant variation, which makes it even harder to detect. So now what happens on the firewall side? Now we've identified this, and the steps are pretty much in line with what Stephanie had mentioned, is that be going beyond just lexical analysis. We need to go more into a syntactic kind of mechanisms, and there is where we basically introduce AIs. So one particular area we are currently looking into is using existing or losing past knowledge of messages, and also being able to do analysis on originating numbers and sending numbers, and then identify specific target communications, and then analyze those messages. And then once we find a trend in there, that the AI is effectively looking out for what are the kinds of trends, and therefore then highlight on what are the sources that are showing up again and again. So what is the frequency of the originators, and thereby then highlighting, okay, then these are effectively candidates that are perpetrating an attack of sorts. But again, the thing is, this is very nascent, because the principal challenge of AIs that we've seen so far is to train them right, and that's an incremental process. So that is where we reach out to principal customers and partners to understand, because they've got the bulk of data that we need to bring into these AIs, so that they can become a solution that addresses the broader scope of the problem.
All right. Thanks, Iftikhar. Both you and Stephanie brought up using the data better, and I'll bring all three of you in on this one. We talk a lot about different at MEP, because we represent all these different members. A lot of the initiatives that we work on are initiatives where members need to collaborate. So they'll approach MEP and say, we have an idea, but we need to work with the industry in order to achieve our objective. And can you facilitate? And one of the challenges we often hear is we'd like to share the data, but we can't. Or we're a bit nervous about sharing the data, either for GDPR reasons or whatever legal reasons might exist in a given market. Maybe this is too broad a question, but are you sharing data with some of your key partners? Are you able to? Do you want to? What are some of the hurdles? Stephanie, do you mind if I go to you first on this one?
Yeah, so we are actually sharing data with our customers. We have a product called Insights, and we're building that product to be able to share as much data as customers want. In terms of partners, we are downstream, and so we are actually consuming data from carriers and from our downstream partners. I would say that we're working very hard to get access to real time and relevant data, but we are consuming it from a carrier partner and our downstream partners. Yes.
And so I guess it would be anonymized, or there's right. So you're getting the trends. Paul, do you have any take on this, or is Vonage consuming a lot of data and sharing it with its key stakeholders or partners?
Yes, and we'd love to do more. So what I would say to people who are concerned about sharing data is, because that tends to be the position that you start from, and it is very market specific. You obviously need to check in the local markets that you're operating in, but for example, here in the UK, if you have a legitimate suspicion of fraud, you have a reasonable purpose for the detection and prevention of crime to share data. That is a line the UK Information Commissioner has published. That guidance is on the ICO's website, and we've worked with other smaller national industry bodies like CCUK. So we've set up an information sharing scheme with the industry using the UK National Trading Standards Organisation. So it's a government organisation, and they take data in from participants like Vonage. They will do the investigation. They will also clean and anonymise and wipe that data, and then share an industry report back to members, so that if a bad actor is offboarded from Vonage, they don't immediately go to a bandwidth. So you would be able to consume that data to avoid onboarding that same customer. And I think I'd love to be able to do that, and I would lean into MEF here. There's a clear opportunity, but I'd love to be able to facilitate that on a global scale. That would be that would be the really cool thing.
Agreed. And Iftikhar, I think we were talking yesterday when we were getting ready for this panel around the need to feed the correct data to firewalls and to do audits to ensure that the firewalls continue to be effective. Maybe you could expand a bit on that.
Yes. Okay. So, good point. The thing is, there is a general thinking out there is that once a firewall is a static solution, so once you put it in, you kind of let it run and it'll keep on adapting. But unfortunately, that's not how firewalls work. Firewalls require a constant care in that sense that the rules need to be defined if they are rule based, and the same would apply when the scenario is extended to AIs. So firewalls can only be effective if they are kept updated and they are adapted to meet challenges as they change. So just to put it into context and make it more simpler is the fraudsters are out there for an economic gain, and they are very good at what they do. So what they see is that when they do identify when their campaigns, when their attacks are failing, they adapt to the next alternative. So the techniques keep changing, and so you cannot expect that a firewall that is designed to identify and block a certain technique will automatically change, because it needs to be modified accordingly. So new rules, new capability, even new data. So depending on how the AIs are trained, and that's one of our principal focuses when we work in AI is how does the AI become, how do you take that into account, or let's call it, how does the AI life cycle work? That's one of the challenges, because they need to be adapted, and that's where having the best data out there to train those AIs so that the trained AIs go in can show the most effect. But this is a working challenge that we are currently looking into.
Right. Yeah, I'm hopeful, but I see like the challenge ahead of us as well. But it feels like when we speak to members, there's a huge will to reduce the amount of fraud that's out there. And I do think this piece around collaboration, data sharing, and all the different types of technical solutions that are out there are the way forward. Maybe we could take this back a bit. We've been solely focused on AIT. What other types of fraud are you seeing, and what are you doing to deal with that one? Maybe Stephanie, what else is bandwidth other than AIT?
So I think during the U.S. presidential election, bandwidth saw some impersonation. So basically taking a campaign and presenting the sender to be someone they weren't. And we kind of struggled with how do we address this, especially given the fact that the U.S. presidential election and the traffic being sent was so sensitive. And so what we ended up doing is we ended up going back to the original campaign that was registered and identifying campaign drift. And so we were actually able to take the campaign down and stop the impersonated traffic by citing campaign drift. So just one example, there are obviously several other types of fraud, and maybe, Paul can weigh in here, but I would say that was probably the biggest and most interesting just because of the nature of that traffic.
I find the U.S. market is, sorry, Paul, I'll hand it over to you in a second. I just had to say that I find the U.S. market is so unique in this sense, the election-related fraud.
Right.
From my experience, we don't really see that in European elections or
exactly,
questions.
or in Canada yet.
Yeah.
So it is unique. Some would argue, tumultuous, but it does make for an exciting time.
Absolutely. Paul, you were going to say?
Yeah. So, well, I was going to say exactly that. It makes for an exciting time for those kind of odd people like us that get really, really charged by certain types of fraud. And wow, that's really interesting. That's amazing.
Right.
It's like other people would be freaking out at that. But,
right.
Yeah. So
it is. It's interesting. That was my reaction too. I'm like, so this is what they're doing now.
There we go. So, but yeah. So all of that. And I think the other thing I would add to build on is what we've seen as well, where we've applied controls, particularly around messaging and things like that, is remember fraudsters are agile, they're smart, they're clever, they're all of these things. And some of them, and make no mistake, some of it is not just an individual fraud, it's organized crime. Some of it could, some of it we suspect is even state-sponsored groups. This can be huge. So these are not amateurs. So what we've seen, and the advice I was giving, is you need to think holistically about your protection. Where we have, for example, run major initiatives to clamp down on messaging fraud, we're just squeezing the balloon. And then a few weeks later, we'll see exactly the same things pop up using TTS within voice calls. And it's like, of course. And it moves, and you deal with that. Then there'll be audio streaming within a call, and then and then, and it's like thinking holistically about you can't just solve for SMS, you can't just solve for this. You need to be thinking voice and things coming down the line, AI and Gen AI and better voices and all of the benefits that's going to bring for good as a product. For people wanting to build out call centers with human sounding voices, great. It's also going to make frauds far more compelling and more difficult to spot. And some regulators, I know FCC are leaning in quite heavily on use of AI within calls at the moment. It's use of AI for impersonating a specific person is a crime. But regulators are I'm not sure what the rest of you are seeing, but I'm seeing regulators are never quick, but I'm seeing the pace of change of regulators is increasing. Right, this is only going one way. So
the same way the industry is trying to collaborate better. I think regulators are looking to each other to collaborate better, and we're seeing trends. Trend emerges in one market, and regulators see that, and they start to piggyback on it. We only have about a minute or two left. Iftikhar, any positive way to end this panel? Any closing remarks?
I think AI is one of the principal solutions to the problem. It's not the only one. And I think in order to, so there are two aspects. One is it requires a closer cooperation between all the significant key players in order to restore trust and maintain trust in the channel, because that is one of the things that messaging channels like SMSs offer. And if it fails to show that, then effectively you have consumers and brands move over elsewhere. And then the other thing is regulators. And I'd had recent discussions with some customers in context of RCS, and regulators only see this as, well, there is an SMS policy we built, and the same can be just shifted, lift and shifted off to the RCS. And what you realize is that there is a lot of gap in the in building up knowledge for the regulators in order to draft better policies, because and in the absence of that, they might just make policies that are not viable for the industry overall.
Well, speaking to the three of you inspires me that we will get this problem solved eventually, sooner than later. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us on today's panel. I think the time went by really fast, and I hope we can do this again sometime soon. So thanks, everyone, once again, and have a pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having us. Bye.